I haven't done it as much recently, but I used to do these yearly anniversary videos for the Switch every time we got to March 3rd of any year, just kind of talking about the Switch and where it's been and where it's going and all that stuff. So I haven't done it as much in recent years, but this year I felt like I had a really good angle, a really good hook, because this year the Switch turned 7. And 7 years is the longest that any Nintendo home console has gone without being replaced. That basically means that this is the longest console generation that Nintendo has ever had. But then the problem was that I did the math and I was like, oh no, wait, we still have a few months. It's actually going to be July is when it becomes the longest running Nintendo console generation. So I gotta wait a little while, but that's okay. I'll do a whole video for it and I'll have it ready to go the day that happens. And then I forgot. And then and then everybody else was doing their articles and videos about it. And I realized that I had forgotten to remember. But whatever. I'm here talking about it now, not making a big old video about it on the main channel or anything. We'll just do a fun little topic, Arlo, about it, because I do think that it's interesting. Previously, Nintendo's longest-running home console generation was the NES generation. It ran from 1983 to 1990. It was about 7 years before the Famicom was replaced with the Super Famicom. And it's funny because at that point, technology was moving so fast that console generations became much shorter for a while, like 4 or 5 years. Even the technical leap from Super NES to N64, just this massive graphical leap that happened in a relatively small amount of time, and then only after that, after a few generations, did things start to kind of stretch out again and get, 7 became the new standard. And now the Switch is Nintendo's longest running primary home console, and I know it's a little bit weird because we kind of consider it a home console because it's Nintendo's main thing, but it's also a handheld, but it's not really a dedicated handheld, so I personally lump it in with home console, because the real thing is console generations, they're usually dictated by the home consoles. The handhelds have always been kind of secondary, not necessarily secondary to Nintendo's business. They've always been really important, but as far as generations go, I don't know, it's usually the home consoles that we follow. Because if you do go by handhelds, the Switch is not the longest running Nintendo console at all. The Game Boy generation ran for 12 years. The Game Boy was introduced in 1989, and then the Game Boy Advance way in 2001. And Nintendo considers that whole stretch of time the Game Boy generation. I don't see it that way. The Game Boy Color, to me, just felt like a new system. I know it was just the same thing with Color, but you can't play Game Boy Color games on a Game Boy. That, to me, right there, the fact that the games are exclusive, to me, that means that is its own system. However, even if you do go by my method of determining where it cuts off, that's still 1989 to 1998. That's still 9 years. So yeah, the Game Boy was still older than the Switch is now when the Game Boy Color was introduced. And I don't think the Switch is quite gonna hit that 9-year mark. Next year, it'll hit the 8-year mark, and then we'll get the Switch 2, probably. So it's not quite gonna make it, but it is still something to say that this is the longest home console generation that Nintendo has ever experienced. And it is certainly well-deserved. The health of a system is really what determines how long it goes, how long you think you can sell it. The NES kind of revitalized the game industry, at least the console game industry, and so it was a really, really big deal, so Nintendo was able to sell it for quite a long time. And now we have the Switch, which itself has completely revitalized, overhauled, just completely jump-started all over again Nintendo's own, place in the industry. And it really says something about the Switch and the quality of its games and how much it's impacting the industry, that even now, even though this is the longest generation, we're still a ways off from the next one starting. Momentum is still so good. Nintendo is still releasing so many games for the platform. It's still selling really well. Sure, we're near the end of the generation, so sales are starting to flag. You can kind of see that it's reached its peak, and now it's gonna drop year over year. So it's it's definitely time to start talking about the next thing, but they're not desperate for it. you know, sales aren't just like tanking. They're not just falling off a cliff and they're scrambling to get out the next system. Nah, Switch is still selling. It's still going. We're still buying games for it. And like, I just think that's crazy. After 7 years, the longest Nintendo home console generation ever, and it's still going strong. And 7 years is just, it's such a long time. This is a thing that happens a lot more the older you get, how like the beginning of the Switch generation, 2017, it simultaneously feels like a million years ago and yesterday. Like I remember the launch so well, and that I'm remembering there, like, yeah, like I can remember being in that place so clearly, and then at the same time I'm like, everything was completely different back then. Just like 2017, just a different age of humanity. Everything, even just the gaming landscape, was actually really different. And it's like, you know, it's everything changes so gradually that it's easy to lose sight of it. But just, I don't know, just looking at where the industry was and what kind of games were being made, like things were pretty different back in 2017. Okay, this is a total aside, but who cares? This is a channel where I get to ramble. I'm gonna do it. I'm working on a video right now about Metroidvanias, more or less. And in it, I talk about how 2009 is when Shadow Complex came out. And at the time, somebody making a Metroidvania, like making a game that's like Super Metroid, but it's not Super Metroid, was like really, really novel. As recently as 15 years ago, someone doing a classic style Metroidvania was still like, whoa, was still like a new thing. And then they started coming more steadily after that. But even like, it took years to get to the point where they were, I mean, like right now they're coming in a flood. There are a million Metroidvanias to play. But like at the beginning of the Switch generation, only 8 years after Shadow Complex, there were definitely a lot more Metroidvanias. It was a well-established genre, but even then, there weren't like that many, at least like notable ones. You know, I even remember like at the tail end of the Wii U, it's like, oh yeah, like Guacamelee, you know, like just like your standout ones. So I don't know, just looking at genres and looking back to 2017 and just seeing how like, I don't know, these things that we completely take for granted and that are just a permanent part of the gaming landscape and of our lives were not nearly as well established even in 2017, even though it feels like yesterday that the Switch came out. Anyway, I guess I'm just saying I think it's crazy how much has changed since the Switch came out, and yet it is still going strong. It's still just trucking along. And of course, you gotta wonder, you gotta speculate, you gotta get way ahead of yourself. I do, at least. The Switch 2, when it comes along, how long will that generation be? Was this kind of an anomaly? I mean, I know 7 years is kind of becoming the industry standard, but Switch is gonna end up being more like 8. Can we expect the same from the Switch 2? On the one hand, it might not be such an example of like crazy lightning in a bottle as the first Switch. You know, it'll be very successful, but I don't know if it'll be quite as successful. But at the same time, the better the technology gets, the less need that we have to replace it quickly. And I've said before that like, we're kind of reaching a peak as far as like the need for graphical power goes. So if you have the Switch 2, like that really might genuinely last Nintendo like a long time. A really long time. Just like looking at PS4 games, like they look so good. They're amazing. They're like still basically everything you could want. So like if you have the Switch 2, if it's as powerful as a PS4 or PS4 Pro or whatever, you know, maybe later you do a mid-generation upgrade, I could see that lasting a long time. Just like I could see it being an even longer generation than the Switch one, but whatever, we'll see when we get there in 10 years or whatever. And that is the end of my video about how this is the longest Nintendo generation ever. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.